So good evening. We spent a long time figuring out what the walk-on music should be, and it wasn't that. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. Welcome to the 42nd Annual Semiconductor Industry Award Dinner. I'm John Neuffer, SIA President and CEO. On behalf of the SIA Board, thank you for joining us tonight. Before we start dinner, I'd like to recognize the following platinum and gold sponsors whose support has made tonight's wonderful program possible: IBM, Intel, Micron, Salesforce, Western Digital, AMD, Deutsche Bank, the state of Indiana, Marvell, ON Semiconductor, Qualcomm, Samsung, and Texas Instruments. Now, in the run-through, I left one of those guys out. And Dan, I didn't do that again, did I? I won't tell you which one it was either. So let's have a huge, let's have a round of applause for our sponsors. Thank you very much. So, while I'm very much looking forward to other parts of the evening, this is the best part of the evening for me. I'd like to thank the outstanding young men and women of the FIRST Robotics program standing over here who demonstrated their projects during tonight's reception. They've done it several years in a row. So let's see how much young brain power we can pack onto this little stage. Come on up, guys. Come on over here, I don't bite, not much. Great. So if you ever have any doubts about the future of our industry, these kids should leave you feeling comfortable that our future is bright. I warned these kids I was going to have, do we have a mic here that I can use? I have a question for these kids. Is that coming up? Here it is. Surprise question for these kids. Who wants to be the lucky donor? Who would like to answer my question? Okay, I actually have two.
Oh boy.
Okay, first, this is the most serious one. Who's your most famous Star Wars hero? Okay, I was kidding on that.
I don't want to start any wars.
The next one, what are you going to be when you grow up? And it's okay to say semiconductor engineer, electrical engineer. Go for it.
Well, I'm applying to colleges as an electrical engineer, so I want to work at companies like Boston Dynamics or something like that.
You got the job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Let's give these guys a big hand. And but actually, before we do that, I want to recognize Teresa Bateman. Is she out there somewhere? Thank you. So she helped bring these kids here. She's done it every year. Got a great organization. Thank you very much. I also want to encourage everyone to save the dates for the first upcoming regional competitions. I think they're right here. Now, before we let you guys go home and finish your homework, we got some chocolates for you. Actually, you're going to get those on the way out. Let's give these kids a great big hand. Thank you. Thanks, guys. All right, so please enjoy your dinner. We'll be resuming tonight's program shortly. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage, John Neuffer.
Okay, we're going to get things started again here. Thanks once again for joining us. We have an excellent program planned. In a few minutes, we'll hear from SIA's newly elected chair, Keith Jackson, leader of ON Semiconductor, sitting right here. Later, we'll present awards to two trailblazers in the field of semiconductor research. Then we'll recognize a true semiconductor icon, Dr. Robert Dennard, with the 2019 Noyce Award. And we'll conclude tonight's program by hearing from our keynote speaker, the Honorable Kevin Rudd. He'll share his thoughts with us on one of the most pressing topics for our industry, our trade and economic relationship with China. So, the U.S.-China trade war is at the center of choppy waters we're navigating these days as an industry and as a country. And there are deeply divided views in Washington on how to overcome our challenges. It's no great revelation to forecast that the political fractures in Washington will likely grow larger in 2020, with an impeachment inquiry looming and another election cycle already upon us. And our industry, for better or for worse, finds itself at the eye of the storm on trade and many major issues being debated in our nation's capital. That's why it's no exaggeration to say that this is one of the most pivotal times in our industry's history. And the actions we take now will have far-reaching implications for the next decade and beyond. The good news is SIA and our members are doubling down on efforts to make sure our voice is heard in Washington. And we have a very compelling story to tell. Our industry has an enormous impact on America's economy, national security, and technology leadership. We employ 250,000 people in the U.S. and support jobs for 1 million additional workers. We are one of America's top exports, and only after airplanes and oil, and we fall only after airplanes and oil, and now we're ahead of cars in terms of exports. We invest more in R&D than every other industry except pharmaceuticals, and we are absolutely essential to the emerging technologies that will shape our economy and our society: AI, quantum computing, 5G and 6G, and many others. Future innovations can be hard to predict for sure, but you can be certain of this: the next big things will be powered by semiconductors. But as I have suggested, our challenges are substantial. Global trade, so critical to the global semiconductor supply chain, is under attack like never before. In perhaps the most glaring example, some officials in Washington and Beijing are calling for the decoupling or disentanglement of U.S. and Chinese supply chains. And many of the top electronics firms in China are now blacklisted from procuring American technology. In addition, the cost and technical hurdles of maintaining leading-edge semiconductor innovation have never been greater, and foreign governments are investing ambitiously to challenge U.S. leadership in semiconductors and the many technologies they enable. Fortunately, as our challenges have grown, so too has SIA's tent and our industry's unity of purpose. This year alone, we've added 6 major new members: Broadcom, Cirrus Logic, Lattice Semiconductor, MediaTek, NXP, and Cadence. We now represent 95% of the U.S. semiconductor sector and a large and growing share of our global industry. Through this impressive coalition, SIA has worked this year to advance our policy blueprint called Winning the Future. The blueprint rests on 3 pillars: invest in research, attract and develop a skilled workforce, and ensure access to global markets and protect intellectual property around the world. These 3 pillars reflect our belief that while we must tirelessly fight policies that restrict our ability to compete and innovate, the best way to win the race is to simply run faster. We've made good progress in these areas this year. Congress and the White House have recognized the importance of U.S. semiconductor leadership and the need for funding semiconductor research. The House of Representatives passed legislation that would make needed reforms to America's high-skilled immigration system, and we're urging the Senate to follow suit. And a key free trade agreement, the USMCA with Mexico and Canada, seems to be moving closer to congressional approval. But of course, we have much to do. Earlier today, the SIA board met and finalized our 2020 plan to continue moving the ball forward on the blueprint's ambitious calls to action. Here are some highlights. First, we'll urge policymakers to triple federal investments in semiconductor research over the next 5 years to about $5 billion and double funding for research in related fields to about $9 billion annually. Second, we'll ask government leaders to reform the high-skilled immigration system and increase federal investment in STEM education by 50%. Third, we'll push for maintaining an open and vibrant global supply chain, and even as some in Washington doubt its importance, as well, we'll press for strong protections for our industry's valuable IP. This is an aspirational plan, to be sure, but our industry was built on aspirational plans. As I close, I'd like to thank you for making tonight special and for helping to make our industry what it is today. I am proud to be part of this industry and to fight for it. Working together, we can overcome our challenges and make the next decade even stronger than the last. Thank you. Okay, now it's time to introduce you to the man who will help lead the way in 2020 as SIA Chair. But before I do, I'd like to take a moment to give a heartfelt thanks to his predecessor, SIA's outgoing chair, Sanjay Mehrotra of Micron. Sanjay is a tireless advocate for our industry and SIA, as we all know, and it's been personally enriching to work so closely with Sanjay this year. Sanjay, I've learned a lot from you. I appreciate your leadership. He has helped guide SIA through a turbulent year in Washington, and our industry is stronger because of his efforts, and SIA is stronger because of his efforts. Sanjay, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for your leadership as SIA Chair. Let's give another hand to Sanjay. Earlier today, Sanjay passed the baton to his highly capable successor as SIA's 2020 Chair on Semiconductors, Keith Jackson. Keith is an accomplished and well-respected industry leader with a strong background in semiconductor technology. He has spent the better part of the last 2 decades helping to build ON Semiconductor into what it is today. We look forward to his leadership of SIA in the year ahead. Please join me in welcoming our friend and SIA's 2020 Chair, Keith Jackson.
Good evening, and thank you, John, for the introduction. It's truly a pleasure to be part of SIA. Having spent my entire career in the semiconductor industry, I admire that the SIA is nonpartisan, giving the industry a singular voice in a very political world. This will be increasingly important for all of us in this room in the coming year. This evening, I would like to echo John's sentiments from the perspective of a CEO and as this year's chair of SIA. This year will be a big one for us. For starters, we are entering an election year, and our focus as a collaborative SIA group cannot waver. During a time when there may be more heat than light, it's important to educate those outside our industry of the benefits citizens enjoy as a result of technology advances. These advances are only possible because the semiconductor industry is truly global. The industry thrives off the global market and depends on global supply chains. We will need to focus on free trade and innovation, as these are the building blocks of success in our industry. Our actions as leaders will help set the stage for innovators and our industry for decades to come. Semiconductor companies continue to shape the pace of innovation through heavy investment in R&D, and will need the best and brightest in the world to drive that innovation. We are entering a time when we are not only competing with other companies, we are competing with governments. We will need to rely on each other and the strengths of our industry to address this challenge. Our industry provided the building blocks for systems designers, and now we are creating entire systems on integrated circuits. It's the innovation of engineers in our industry that has created societal productivity and life-changing technologies. Our roles as architects of devices and networks has had tremendous impact on humanity and has transformed the way people learn, connect, and serve communities across the globe. Parents in developing and developed countries can now hear their children's voices for the first time with hearing aids. Patients can now monitor blood glucose levels with continuous glucose monitors that are connected to their smart devices. And medical professionals can now take healthcare to remote regions, instantly improving the lives of people where medical care and hospitals aren't available. Innovation in our sector has brought us the highly connected world that we are all fortunate to enjoy. Or perhaps our wallets are unfortunate to enjoy with one-click shopping. It's enabling artificial intelligence, renewable energy sources, electric vehicle electrification, and autonomous driving. Our engineers are the enablers that have driven world-changing innovation over the last 50 years. As far as we have come, there is still much more innovation left to do. Even as Moore's Law continues to be more challenging, there are advances still left to be done in materials, heterogeneous integration, and computing techniques. These are the technological advances and challenges that drive us as an industry. Another challenge, the assault on free trade. The U.S. semiconductor industry hinges upon access to global markets if we are to remain leaders. 80% of our customers are overseas, and global supply chains have helped us become amazingly innovative and efficient. It's important to help our legislators understand our industry and how their decisions impact our continued technological advancements. To understand that capital costs in our industry are extreme and the need for the entire global market to thrive, and that both governments and industry need to continue to invest in R&D, and that we must support future innovation through education from K-12 to the university level. It's vital for us to stay collectively focused as there are macroeconomic and political factors that threaten to derail us from our objectives. Through unity, by working together, we can make a difference. It's the reason many of us joined the industry so many years ago. We will continue to encounter global pressures on the industry, to be sure, and we will continue to be a formidable force as we confront these pressures as long as we hang together, pressing forward in a shared enterprise devoted to innovation, building the talent base, and insisting that our global markets must remain open. These are the core messages we need to take to our lawmakers, underscoring that thriving innovation and open markets are necessary preconditions if consumers are going to continue to reap the benefits of our magical technologies. We all compete against each other, and sometimes fiercely, but we have a common vision. Over the next year, the next decade, the next 50 years, our amazing industry will improve the lives of people around the world in ways unimagined today. Our innovations will yield even greater advancements to people's health, improving the economic conditions for all, making the world a safer place, and making it a greener world for our grandchildren. At risk of being hyperbolic, but I don't think so, our industry is everything. Virtually all technological advancements rest on what we achieve. Please join me in our commitment to innovation, building a stronger talent base, advocating free trade, and working together through SIA and otherwise to ensure a bright future for the semiconductor industry. Thank you. Now we'd like to present SIA's University Research Awards to two distinguished professors who have made outstanding contributions to semiconductor research. Dr. Jason Kong of the University of California, Los Angeles, and Dr. Jesus Del Alamo of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thanks largely to the leading edge work of researchers like Dr. Kong and Dr. Del Alamo, the semiconductor industry is America's most innovative sector and a major contributor to our country's economic strength, technological leadership, and global competitiveness. I'd like to thank our partners at the Semiconductor Research Corporation, including SRC CEO Ken Hansen, who is here tonight, for identifying these accomplished university researchers as candidates for this award. With that, let's take a moment to recognize each of our award winners and then welcome them to accept the awards and say a few words. Dr. Jason Kong is Distinguished Chancellor's Professor at the Computer Science Department of UCLA and Director of the Center of Domain-Specific Computing and the VLSI Architecture, Synthesis, and Technology Laboratory. He has been selected to receive the University Research Award for demonstrating excellence in design research. Specifically, he is being honored for his achievements over the past 30 years in advancing the industry's interconnect estimation and optimization, customizable computing with the use of FPGAs, and high-level synthesis. Dr. Kong has published over 400 research papers in these areas, including 12 Best Paper Awards and 3 10-year retrospective Most Influential Paper Awards. He has also founded 3 startup companies and graduated dozens of PhD students. Please join me in recognizing our first recipient of SIA's 2019 University Research Award, Dr. Jason Kong. Come on up.
Wow. Thank you, SIA and SRC, for this wonderful recognition. I'm greatly honored and humbled to receive this award among such a distinguished list of the past winners. First, I'd like to thank SRC for multi-decade support. I look back, my first SRC grant was 1998 on interconnect optimization. I also had the pleasure to work with a number of SIA companies directly, such as Cadence, IBM, Intel, Samsung, Synopsys, and Xilinx. And they provided not only valuable financial support, they also gave us the leading edge problems which inspired our research. This award really goes to multiple generations of PhD students, postdocs, and also collaborators across the globe. Last certainly not least, I want to thank my wife Jing and Aris for their constant love, support, and understanding. They are the source of strength and inspiration even at the most difficult time. Before I leave, a lot of you probably will have this question that what did you do exactly? I got this question when the press release came out. The one staff member in the department came to ask me, he says, what's your research about? So I thought for a moment, and I told her the following story. There's this couple, and the wife is a well-recognized interior designer, and the husband is a very successful real estate developer. He's so successful that he doubles his house every 18 months. And all his friends envy this couple, but actually the wife lives a very hectic life. She's the one who has to pick up the carpet, select the furniture, make decisions on the paintings and the decorations in every room. Otherwise, this ever-spending house is just a pile of concrete, right? So in this room, and the husband is called the Moore's Law, and my research is to make sure the wife has a simple, enjoyable, and productive life. The theme of our research is democratize customizable computing. I want every one of you and your family members to be able to design a customized computing engine if he or she chooses to do. Right, so that's the barrier we want to lower. When we succeed, I think all of you will flourish. So we count on you for your continued support. Thank you again for this wonderful recognition.
Now let's turn our attention to our second University Research Award winner. Dr. Jesus Del Alamo is Director of Microsystems Technology Laboratories and Professor of Electrical Engineering at MIT. He will receive the honor for excellence in semiconductor technology research. Specifically, Dr. Del Alamo is being recognized for significant contributions over more than 30 years to education and the advancement of semiconductor devices in physics, technology, modeling, and response reliability. His innovations have been adopted and deployed in many commercial semiconductor fabs, providing the foundation for increased performance and integration and opening doors to many new applications. In addition, Dr. Del Alamo has received Baker Memorial Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, the Edgerton Junior Faculty Achievement Award, and the Lewis Smolin Award for Excellence in Teaching, among many other achievements in education. Please join me in congratulating our second recipient of SIA's 2019 University Research Award, Dr. Jesus Del Alamo. Please come up.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored having been selected for this award. It really means the world to me to receive this award from the semiconductor industry, an industry that I profoundly respect and admire. In fact, I feel blessed that my academic career has overlapped over a fairly good chunk with Moore's Law, if we want to call it that way. And in fact, witnessing the extraordinary progress of this industry over the last 4 decades, and at times playing a modest role in it, has really been an exhilarating experience. And I want to believe that these extraordinary achievements of this industry are partly due to the enduring partnership that the industry has had with the research universities across the country over this period of time. And in fact, the very existence of these awards, I think, shows how much appreciation there is for the role of university research in the industry, and I really very much admire that. And so all this is more important, I think, as we find ourselves right now at a very unique crossroads where future progress is going to demand new materials, new devices, new circuits, new concepts all across the board. And I tell my students this is a really exciting time to join this industry because there is the opportunity of making seminal inventions that are going to profoundly transform this industry and benefit human society. It really is a wonderful time. Thank you very much for this award. It really means a lot to me.
So it's probably not a career enhancer to tell your chairman of the board to get off the stage. Congratulations again to Professor Kong and Professor Del Alamo. Let's give them another big round of applause. Now it's time to turn our attention to presenting the semiconductor industry's top honor to an industry icon, Dr. Robert H. Dennard. Unfortunately, Bob wasn't able to make the cross-country trip today, but we're going to celebrate him in absentia. And maybe if we cheer loud enough, he'll hear us from across the country. We'll start a short video about the award's namesake, the great Robert Noyce. That video chokes me up every year. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the presenter of this year's Noyce Award. John Kelly is an icon in our industry and authority on semiconductor technology. During his remarkable career spanning nearly 40 decades, he has helped lead IBM's work on semiconductors, supercomputers, AI, quantum, and many, many more technologies. He's a former SIA chair. He sits on the current SIA board. And he's a 2009 recipient of this very award for his many accomplishments. Please join me in welcoming our friend, IBM Executive Vice President, John Kelly.
And good evening, everyone. As John mentioned, I'm completing my 4th decade in this industry, and it is just wonderful to be with all of you again here this evening. If there's one thing I've learned in my 40 years in this industry, is that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, the icons that built this industry. And I'm delighted tonight to celebrate another great contributor to the semiconductor industry. I'm honored to present the Robert Noyce Award to Dr. Robert Dennard, IBM Fellow Emeritus. Now, it's no exaggeration to say, as Keith said earlier, all of our systems and our infrastructure, our whole society is underpinned by semiconductor technology at its core. And a large part, no, a huge part of this industry is thanks to Dr. Bob Dennard. And while many of the giants of our industry are known for one big thing, Bob Dennard has 2 incredible achievements that have driven our industry. First, he invented the single-cell DRAM, which is, of course, an anchor of our industry. And as if that wasn't enough, he invented the scaling equations, or Dennard scaling, which, for those of you that aren't aware, is the fundamental physics that has taught us how to drive Moore's Law for decades. And while the Noyce Award is a capstone to Bob's career, it sits on top of countless other accomplishments, including dozens of patents, hundreds of publications, the National Medal of Technology, the Kyoto Prize, and the National Academy of Engineers Draper Prize, which are the highest honors for any engineer in the world. But again, this Noyce Award for Bob, as he said to me, is the capstone. Beyond this, Bob has been my friend, my colleague, and my advisor for my 4 decades in this industry, and most importantly, he has been my inspiration. Now I'd like to play a short tribute video of Bob Dennard's career.
I remember when I first joined the company in the 80s, Bob Dennard was the special guy. He had invented so much of the technology, and he was the de facto leader in semiconductors at the time in IBM.
The wonderful thing about Bob Dennard's life is that it's a story of America's transition literally from an agrarian society to a modern microelectronic powerhouse. Dennard grew up in rural Texas. He grew up for a while on a farm without electricity in the early 1930s. He was educated in a one-room schoolhouse. He came to Carnegie Mellon to get a PhD in electrical engineering and showed up at IBM right at the time when the microelectronics industry was coming into existence.
I remember the first time I came here, I was just stunned by the building. I said, you get to work in a place like this? The building itself inspires you.
Was this Bob's office the entire time you were at Yorktown?
Yes. So that's Bob's office that we did many of our discussions, heated arguments and all that. And you can see his blackboard, which is kind of famous, and he still uses it.
Dennard's first contribution was in 1966 when he invented a memory device called a dynamic random access memory, the single-cell transistor. And what was important about the DRAM is it became the fundamental building block for this industry, which literally transformed the entire world.
It would be impossible to create a lot of the products that we've created through all these years, the games, the cell phones. I mean, it just wouldn't be possible.
It's just a one transistor, one capacitor. Yeah, it's so simple. It's a piece of very beautiful physics.
I think the simplicity which was clear in Bob's mind was not clear in anybody else's mind.
Yes. We've had a term in IBM for decades, which is wild ducks. So this was an ad from the mid-1960s of wild ducks, and you can see everybody's flying in that direction except one duck going that way.
Doesn't fly in formation.
And that's a classic. If this was our researchers in the 60s, that would be Bob Dennard going in the other direction.
So after Dennard invented the single-cell transistor, he made a second significant contribution, which in a sense is even more important. In 1972 and then again in 1974, he outlined what he called the scaling theory. With each generation of technology, these devices got smaller, they required less power, and the computers got more powerful. And that process led through something that's referred to as the golden era of scaling.
So Moore's law seems like a straight line on a semi-log, but it wasn't when you look under the covers. Every introduction of a new lithography tool was another sort of speed bump where we had to reinvent masks, photoresist, the whole deal. And then fast forward, throughout this, Bob taught us back in the scaling laws that you had to keep dropping the voltage or else the power density would get too much to deal with. I remember thinking we'll never break the 1 micron barrier. And here we are at 5 nanometers.
Bob is very nurturing and tough at the same time. Literally at the same time. The two sentences that follow each other. One is, you basically don't understand anything, go back to high school. And second thing is, together we can change the world.
And I mean, just gotta love a guy like that.
It's really quite remarkable because once upon a time, at the beginning of the microelectronics era, technology would trickle down from mostly military applications toward the consumer world. But with the falling cost of computing that was enabled by Dennard scaling, technology now comes from the bottom up.
In my time alone, we've gone from a single transistor to tens of millions of transistors on microprocessor chips. On memory chips, we've gone from 16 bits to 64 million bits.
Bob and I would discuss, was there going to be an end to this and to the scaling? And he says, yes, there's an end to scaling, but there's no end to creativity. 5 years from now, we're going to be building a better semiconductor device than we're building today. It's our job to figure out what that better device is.
He was intensely curious, he was a problem solver, and those two qualities are what make the best researchers, not just at IBM, but throughout the entire computing industry. He is seen as the archetype for the best and the brightest of the world's engineers.
Well, as you can see, Bob is simultaneously brilliant, mild-mannered, relentlessly focused on invention, and yet generous with his time in mentoring so many of us. In a sense, Bob is part of a generation of great researchers, such as other Robert Noyce Award winners, Jack Kilby, Ian Ross, and on and on and on. So I suggest that we follow Bob's advice and, quote, think about what you would like the world to be like in 40 years down the road. These things just don't happen by themselves, unquote. And if Bob could be here tonight, and I assure you he wanted to be, but could not for health reasons, I'm sure he would be saying, keep going, keep on searching and inventing. And both he and Bob Noyce would say, go off and do something wonderful. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Mukesh Kher, who IBM Vice President, leads our research, also is the Chairman of the Board of the SRC, to receive the award and convey Bob's thanks to all of you. Mukesh, please join me on the stage.
I can make your hands clap. Said I can make your hands clap. Somebody save your soul, 'cause you've been sinning in the city. I know too many troubles, all these lovers got you losing control. You like a drug to me, a luxury, my sugar and gold. I want your sex and your affection when they're holding you close. 'Cause you don't even know. I can make your hands clap.
Thank you, John. John, you have assigned several challenging tasks for me, but this is the most difficult of all the tasks. It's truly humbling to accept the award on behalf of Bob Dennard. Bob Dennard, his work inspired me since I was in college, and my wish was always to work for him, and my wish really came true when I came to work at IBM and was able to work with Bob Dennard. Now, I'm here to read Bob Dennard's acceptance remark that he carefully wrote for this event. It's my honor to accept Robert Noyce Award and to join the ranks of its previous recipients, true legends and luminaries in our industry. The only one I have time to mention today is Jack Kilby, who is acknowledged as the co-inventor of integrated circuits along with Robert Noyce. But only Kilby lived long enough to share in the year 2000 Nobel Prize in Physics. I got to know my fellow Texan pretty well and admired his modesty. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Jack told a very short story which expresses my attitude here today. It only takes 2 sentences, so listen carefully now. A beaver and a rabbit were sitting on a hillside looking down at the Hoover Dam. The beaver said to the rabbit, "I did not build it myself, but it is based on an idea of mine." As gratifying as my career's work has been, I'm most proud of the collaboration and relationships built with people I've worked alongside to advance semiconductor technology. I gratefully accept this award with those friends, colleagues, and mentors in mind. In particular, I want to acknowledge the contributions of my coworkers, Fritz Gainslin and Hua Yu, in developing and demonstrating the MOSFET scaling principles. I feel very fortunate that I got involved in microelectronics in the middle of 1960s when there were so many opportunities to do exciting work. I joined a group which was developing the first N-channel MOS transistor technology and learning how to use it to do compute functions in integrated circuits. We used the same 4-mask layer scheme that Noyce used for his first IC. Some of you here today will know the tremendous number of mask layers now being used. Our goal was to replace magnetic core random access RAM, which was large, slow, and power hungry. We wanted to build RAM using integrated circuits with 6 small MOS transistors in a flip-flop memory cell to store each bit. I've often told the story of how I came home one evening inspired to find a simpler way. I considered the idea of using a simpler MOS capacitor as the basic memory element, storing each data bit as an electric charge. Each memory cell in a 2-dimensional memory array would have a transistor connected to a data line and a control line to select where the data is to be stored. I considered various ways to read the data out until I suddenly had an eureka moment when I realized that the stored charge could be read back out through the same transistor that wrote it in, and would create a small detectable signal on the data line. I realized immediately that this new memory scheme would become very important. But I couldn't imagine how much it would change computing. I greatly admired the work of Gordon Moore in convincing the semiconductor industry that IC chips should increase in size at a regular pace, even as the size of the circuit elements in the chips was being made scaled down in size by a certain factor. The increased power consumption of those IC chips drove us into the CMOS era and inspired the generalized scaling principles that my fellow workers produced to help guide the industry for many years. Now, I would like to make a few remarks about future. Where can we be, and should we be 20 years from now? I feel that today's silicon processes can be improved with better structures to provide more energy-efficient computing to meet the needs of the 2050s. Now let's hear a few words from Bob himself.
Thanks again for the great honor of your Robert Noyce Award.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mukesh. Let's send a rousing round of applause back to the East Coast and to Dr. Bob Dennard. Thank you.
Okay, now for the grand finale. I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's special keynote speaker, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, who was not once, but twice Australia's Prime Minister. I think he said something earlier today about he made the mistake twice. He is currently president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. In fact, he's the first president of ASPI. Mr. Rudd has decades of experience at the highest levels of government, academia, and influential policy circles. In his years of service, he has established himself as a leader on climate change, healthcare issues, Asian geopolitics, to name a few areas where he's made a significant difference. But tonight, we're going to hear his perspectives and insights on China and the not insignificant troubles swirling around our trade and economic relations with that massive and growing economy. He is a leading authority on China's domestic political economy, international relations, and global trade. And I hear his Mandarin is pretty darn good. The issues involving China are, of course, of great significance to our industry and our country. Mr. Rudd will start with some remarks and then I'll have the chance to sit down with him for a brief discussion on stage. As a teaser, I'm going to ask him what a bag of sugar pilfered in London a long time ago has to do with the price of beans in China. With that, please join me in welcoming a top thinker on China and trade, the Honorable Kevin Rudd.
Well, thank you very much, John, and for also the invitation to be with you here this evening at this important Industry Association event. Thank you for the kind remarks about my Chinese language ability. You couldn't test that yourself, nor could most of the people here in the room. Any native Chinese speakers, I'll send you a check in the mail. I joined the Australian Foreign Service half a lifetime ago as one of their better Chinese language speakers, but consistent with the logic and the tradition of most foreign services around the world, they thought being a good Chinese language speaker I should immediately be posted to Sweden. I came out of that with reasonable Swedish, which has been absolutely useless ever since. Apart from doing very bad imitations of the Swedish chef on The Muppet Show. But I then went off to Beijing, worked. In fact, when I arrived in Beijing, I should tell you this, John, the ambassador had obviously been told that my Chinese sounded pretty good. I just had really good teachers, and they were pretty disciplined. I was less disciplined, but they were kind of insistent that you spoke standard BBC Chinese. And so that's how we learnt. I arrive at the embassy in Beijing. The ambassador says, "I heard your Chinese is good, so I want you to be my interpreter." And I said, "No, I'm not an interpreter. If you're an interpreter, as you know, it's a different set of skills. You've got to interpret what some other schmuck is saying. Whereas if you're speaking yourself, you can control what you're saying, including the stuff that where the limits of your language lie." He said no, and he insisted, and I said no, and he insisted, and I said no, and he said, "You're coming with me." I remember going to this first gathering at the Great Hall of the People. Many of you spend much time in China. The Great Hall of the People. It's designed to intimidate foreign barbarians like us. It's big, okay? In fact, it's very big. Bigger than your average cattle property in Texas. Well, they're much bigger in Australia, actually, but I won't go there. Fighting words, I know. But anyway, you arrive there, and I remember this to this day. We were meeting a Chinese government minister, and the Chinese sense of hierarchy is acute. You know, minister, vice minister, assistant vice minister, chief cook and bottle washer, minor apparatchik, deputy minor apparatchik, down to whoever else. There was at least 12 of them there. On our side, there was 2, me and the ambassador. Ambassador sat there, but because I was an interpreter, you get to sit in the jump seats behind the principals. You've seen the gig. You know, leading foreign barbarian here, leading Chinese interlocutor there, and then 2 interpreters behind. I look in the eyes of the Chinese interpreter, who, unlike me, is a professional interpreter. He sees the sweat pouring from my brow. He's looking calm. It's like a prize fight, and you know you're basically stuffed from the beginning. And our ambassador began with an unremarkable observation. He said, "Australia and China are experiencing a relationship of unprecedented closeness." And I thought, that's very clumsy. We can render that more elegantly. It just needs a little bit of improvement. And so, first blush, determined to impress and intimidate my interpreting opposite number, I rendered it into what I thought was good contemporary Chinese, but with a classical flourish. And so I put it into Chinese, and then I noticed that there were 2 reactions down the Chinese side of the table, or the Chinese side of the room. The senior end of the Chinese hierarchy, you could see the blood visibly draining from their face. And then the junior guys down the end of the room, they just fell about laughing. This is not a good way to begin, by the way, a meeting like this. And so the ambassador's phrase was Australia and China are experiencing a relationship of unprecedented closeness. Apparently what I said, though I didn't intend to say, was that Australia and China are currently having fantastic mutual orgasm. And so, simultaneous. And so that was the last time I was asked to interpret. So when you say I speak good Chinese, yeah, there are limits, and so just be careful who you get to interpret for you when you're next in Beijing, or for that matter, in Washington, D.C. I think we've now got, John, I've got about 10 or 12 minutes. So I'm going to give you a 5-minute blast on how Xi Jinping views the world, and then a 5-minute blast on what I describe as both the mythology and, frankly, the threat of decoupling. Xi Jinping's worldview. It's important to understand how China thinks and why it thinks in the way in which it does. Your experience in business, you're dealing with interlocutors all the time. Too often in this country, I find, and other parts of the West, we just assume that Chinese political leaders think like us. They don't. So what's Xi Jinping's Maslow hierarchy of needs from where he sees the world? If we were sitting here tonight at a meeting of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, 7 guys in a room with same-coloured ties, red. Number 1, keep the party in power. That is the core organising principle of Chinese politics. Keep the Chinese Communist Party in power long term. No transition to any sort of Western political party, contestable democracy. Keep the political party in power. Xi Jinping is a Marxist-Leninist. Number 2, keep the country united and secure the unity which you don't yet have. Hence, that explains China's policies and attitudes to places like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, but also, frankly, China's attitude to the long-term unification with Taiwan. We would regard it as silly for China to throw all of its assets up for grabs in some sort of future strategy to take back Taiwan. This is unfinished core business for the Chinese Communist Party. Never forget this. It's up near the top of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Number 3, grow the economy. 6%, the number which is their calculus for what's necessary for employment growth, full employment, rising living standards, and therefore sustaining party legitimacy. But now with a big twist, and that is, how do we do it sustainably in order to not simply have air that you can't breathe, water which is undrinkable or unusable, or soil which is polluted and grows unsafe food. Growing the economy, but doing so sustainably. But then there's a further twist, which is how you do that in a manner that you are dealing with 36% of your economy, which is from the traded sector of the economy. You are trade exposed in a way in which the United States is not. 26% of American GDP is from its traded sector. And your largest trading partner is now your single greatest strategic adversary, the United States of America. This is high on the agenda of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Communist Party style. Number 4 is develop the People's Liberation Army, turn it into a war-fighting machine capable of fighting and winning wars, not just putting on parades. Number 5. China's 14 neighbouring states. It's got the largest number of land neighbours of any country in the world, except for the Soviet Union, as it was, or Russia as it is, which also has 14. China's ambition is to create benign neighbours, and ultimately neighbours which will be compliant with China's definition of its own core interests, while China has no interest in any form of territorial invasion. Number 6 in this list is securing my maritime periphery to my east. And that's where Uncle Sam comes in. When China looks east to its oceanic approaches, it sees problem, threat, and adversity. And therefore, China's strategy, mindful of what it wants to do on Taiwan, is over time to push the United States back to what is called the second island chain. Think of the map, draw an imaginary line from the Japanese archipelago down to the Philippines, east of Taiwan. That's where, ideally, Chinese military strategy would wish to push the United States, and its foreign policy strategy is aimed at ultimately decoupling the United States from its major Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. 7 is continental periphery, looking west. Enter the Belt and Road Initiative to turn this vast Eurasian continent into a large, new market opportunity for China long term, witness infrastructure, witness the rest, but also a vast corridor which is of itself increasingly benign to China's ultimate foreign policy and political interests. No interest in territorial occupation, that's not part of the Chinese script, but certainly an extension of Chinese influence. And you see it now reaching across Eurasia, into the Gulf, into Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and into Western Europe itself. And finally, in this list, with the rules-based order, the rules-based system internationally, politically, economically, at industry levels, and in other institutional domains, for China's voice to be increasingly heard, and for China increasingly to influence the rules and institutions and standards of the global rules-based system. The reason I run through it in that way is to understand where Xi Jinping's priorities lie and where, for example, the interests of your industry may lie within that remit. Somewhere within 3 and 4, and that is, number 3 is growing the economy, for which what they do in national technology strategy is critical. And on top of that, dealing with this strategic adversary, the United States, which is their principal external trading partner. But acquisition of national capability in all key high technology sectors also being fundamental to the modernization of China's military as well. The other thing I said I'd run through briefly this evening is, given all the above, where do we stand with the great debate about China and America decoupling? I'm not here to discuss American politics with you. You've got plenty of time to do that next year, and I'm not an American, so welcome to your own politics, okay? I've exited mine. But the bottom line is this. Since the end of 2017, with the adoption of the new US national security strategy, 2018, the adoption of the new US national defense strategy, and most recently, as reflected in speeches by Secretary Pompeo, Vice President Pence, etc., the United States has embarked upon a new national strategy of strategic competition with China. I've yet to see its full articulation and all of its policy detail, but this reorientation from a period of 40 years of strategic engagement to strategic competition is a profound shift in America's historical view of China in the post-79 period. But within that, when I begin to hear loose language about, therefore, we are decoupling, I begin to become deeply concerned about what some in the United States may be seeking to do, and frankly, some in China may be seeking to do as well. In my experience in life, it takes 2 to tango, not just 1. And so when I look at decoupling as an amorphous term in international political relations, pulling apart the degrees of economic enmeshment between China and the United States, which have been built up over the last 40 years, is no easy task. But flip through quickly in your mind what is actually transpiring. When those who say decoupling is happening, or some in Washington would say should happen, so that the United States can see the undermining of Chinese long-term economic growth, and that is a view held by some in the Washington national security policy establishment, I look at what is actually happening in key domains. In trade, we've had 18 months of trade war. I think where we've got to with that is, as of the last month or so, both sides have said, we do not wish to damage this trading relationship any further. We will bring about a phase 1 trade deal. We're not sure at this stage whether we can do a phase 2 trade deal, but we've looked over the cliff and we think that's a very dangerous place to take both of us, given the $500 billion trade between us. So are we seeing full decoupling or partial decoupling in trade? Certainly we know the tensions in the technology sector, but I would suggest there's been some beginnings of reappraisal. Foreign direct investment. The flows are uneven, but US flows into China, stock of about 250 billion, all sectors. Annual flows 13 billion, holding up, but Chinese flows into this country slowing to a trickle. Thirdly, look at technology. You know this better than I, but this is where, in fact, the forces of decoupling are felt most, and most particularly in the critical industry sectors of fifth-generation mobile telephony, and where that leads in terms of other industry applications, and in your own critical industry of semiconductors. There, I think the pressures are most acute. Go to capital markets, however. This is a $5 trillion engagement between China and the United States. At present, what I see in both capitals is a non-predisposition to rip these capital markets apart, because the mutual interests are so great and they are so acute. Bond markets, equity markets, but also when I look at continued holdings of US Treasuries. Yes, there are pressures in Washington to rein this in. Look at the two Rubio proposals at present. But what I see in China is, in fact, China seeking to liberalise its capital markets further, in part because it has an unfolding current account deficit starting for the first time this year. Finally, on talent, this worries me most of all in terms of the great decoupling debate. And for the first time in the last 2 years, we've seen year on year an increase in the rejection rate by the United States authorities of visa applications for Chinese government-sponsored scholarships into this country. I also see for the first time the beginnings of a reduction in overall international student participation in universities across this country in the last year. When I look tonight at this parade of young people that you had earlier this evening, these are kids from everywhere. When I look at the diversity and the extraordinary vitality of your industry, you're from everywhere. That's America's great strength. Frankly, it's my country's great strength as well. For God's sake, think twice about turning that tap off, or even turning it half off. My concluding point is simply this. If you look through the decoupling data, yes, there are tensions, yes, there are pressures, but in trade there is a pause. In foreign direct investment, it is an uneven picture. Yes, there are real tensions within tech, but not all tech. In capital markets, in fact, it's the reverse pressure as people seek to deepen capital market engagements between the two countries, not the reverse. And on talent, the beginnings of some concerns. It's a mixed picture. But taking the concluding observation of the person you honoured tonight, Bob Dennard, thinking ahead 40 years. What is our 40-year vision for US-China relations? If it's decoupling, it's the world I don't want to be part of. But with imagination and with policy discipline and clear political vision, it can be something quite radically different and better than that. I thank you for your time.
All right, well, thank you very much for those enlightening comments. I sure learned a lot. Now we're just going to spend a few minutes, a little bit of back and forth. And can I start by asking about that pilfered bag of sugar many years ago that have to do with you and maybe China?
Well, it wasn't me who did the pilfering, but one of the great things about the American Revolution, when you guys finally had enough of the Brits, a sentiment I can understand. The Brits and Australia have a very close relationship. But after you won the American Revolution, Britain lost its penal colony in Savannah, Georgia. And so you could see these guys back in the Admiralty in London, circa 1781 after Yorktown, going, where are we going to send all the crims? And so they blow off these old charts and say, there. That's how Australia was settled. Had you guys lost the Revolutionary War, then it would have been a different story. So anyway, my forebear was a guy called Thomas Rudd. He was sentenced to transportation to Sydney on the Second Fleet in 1790 for stealing a pair of shoes.
A pair of shoes?
Yeah. Well, actually, no, your story's right. He survives. It's a long voyage. It's 9 months in chains to arrive in Sydney. He serves 7 years, goes back to England via China, and then he's back in London, and then he reoffends. Now that takes serious talent in the 18th century to reoffend, and he steals a bag of sugar and gets sent out a second time for another 7 years. And so in the entire criminal history of Australia, which is quite voluminous, I think I have the only forebear to have been transported twice.
And you were Prime Minister twice of Australia.
That's true, and there's a relationship because criminality, no, in politics. But I think had you lost the Revolutionary War, then my forebear would have ended up in Savannah, Georgia, and I could have ended up as governor of Georgia.
So you talked a lot in your remarks about the decoupling phenomena, and that's being expressed in a lot of ways. One of the things that's very top of mind for all of us in this room is the potential trade deal with Beijing. And if you could give us a sense from your perspective, the kind of pressures that Xi Jinping is under, domestic pressures he's under, and how badly does he want a deal? I guess what I'm also kind of asking is who has more leverage? Because the person who wants to deal more has a less leverage.
My judgment was, before the impeachment proceedings began in Washington, that these two political leaders had comparable leverage against each other. For this reason, both faced problematic economies. President Trump looking at 2020, and that is, can I sustain the business cycle again through until Election Day in November of 2020, because he knows the political history. If you're in a recession or a threatened recession, it's very difficult to secure a re-elect. But the Chinese know this as well, so their calculation was the president needed this to be done in order to, as it were, remove that as significant headwinds from the American economy going into the end of next year. But Xi Jinping, in terms of his pressure points, has had faltering domestic growth for the better part of 2 years now. And nothing to do with the trade war, by the way. It really began because of very poor domestic economic policy settings on his part. A reassertion of the role of the party over the state, an indication from the party that didn't want their entrepreneurial class to become too big to the point that they would dominate the party. I think the fact that Jack Ma's decided to step to one side is reflective of that. But also China's own domestic deleveraging strategy to, as it were, deal with the mountain of debt within its own country has been disproportionately placed on the shoulders of the Chinese private sector. But the net bottom line of all that is that Chinese domestic growth has slowed a lot since at least the beginning into the middle of last year. And so Xi Jinping has been under pressure to, frankly, resuscitate growth. and having the additional problem of the US-China trade war has been something he's wanted to get out of the road. So for those slightly different reasons, I think they've both wanted to get this deal done. But most recently, China follows domestic politics in the United States very closely, and they would have seen a president, I think, under somewhat more pressure because of what's happened in the last month or so on the Ukraine matter and the impeachment matter. Bottom line is, I think there will be a phase 1 deal, and by the end of this year. But that's the easy bit. The harder bit will be phase 2 of the trade deal, which deals with some of the more intractable issues.
Let me ask you one more question about the trade deal, and that is, as you know, our president has a rather unconventional style at negotiating and
I've noticed
and running government. If you were sitting in the Oval Office today talking to him about how to run a better U.S.-China trade relationship, what are some of the things that you would?
Me saying to President Trump. Wow. I actually don't know him. I've met him once before, but I actually don't know him. Xi Jinping I've met many times, but President Trump is beyond my pay grade. He has a unique negotiating style. I think that's what I could say. I think I would pose the president simply this question, which is, President Trump, you can't simply get away with a strategy with the Chinese of saying Xi Jinping is my best friend and I respect him enormously on the one hand, and then the next breath say that China is American public enemy number 1. Like, the Chinese ultimately do join the dots, and they just say this doesn't compute. My concern is this: because it doesn't compute, China reaches ultimate cautious conclusions about the direction of policy under President Trump, prospectively under an incoming Democrat administration as well, increasingly hardline, and therefore I, Xi Jinping, need to have a view that this American administration and possibly its successor is serious about decoupling. And therefore, I, Xi Jinping, will take a whole range of contingency measures to prepare for that. And where I become concerned about that, myself, Kevin Rudd, is that these things can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Once you've got the tools out there ready to decouple, to the extent that you can, and I know the tech limitations of that to some extent. So my caution to President Trump would be doing a real estate deal in Manhattan where saying all sorts of different things to shake out the best deal at the end is not the way in which you conduct a deal with a sovereign nation state as old and as experienced as China. I think there's a different way of doing it, which is based on long-term mutual interest, mutual respect, and identifying common values where they exist and working within those parameters.
So, the sanctions against ZTE and Huawei have been viewed by many as the Sputnik moments for the Chinese. And I wonder what your interpretations of how the Chinese have viewed that. Have we awakened a giant? Is a genie out of the bottle that can't be put back in?
Well, I think your industry would know better than I do the extent to which China's indigenous capabilities in computer chips and in semiconductors and in the rest is capable of, shall we say, responding effectively rather than rhetorically to a Sputnik moment. That's a matter for you to judge. What I do know at a political level, having had a series of discussions with my friends and counterparts in China who I've known for some decades now, is that they are concluding, as a worst-case scenario, as I said before, that the American drawbridge is starting to be drawn up, and that therefore, on the question of national self-reliance, that this is a direction which they need to accelerate, and not just in tech and all its subcomponents, not just in the high-tech industry strategy of 2020, not just in artificial intelligence, but across the board, for fear that they end up, as it were, isolated and at a time when they're no longer capable of dealing with it. They also fear one other thing, which is the long-term weaponization of the US dollar against them. They've seen what the United States does with dollar-based sanctions against Russia, against Iran, against Venezuela, against North Korea. And so therefore, China's quite concerned at multiple levels, not just in terms of exposure to your industry, but more broadly about how, if the tools of American policy become fully weaponized, what could this mean for China's future? So we now see, for example, the Chinese beginning to innovate in new forms of international digital currency as well, statements made by the Chinese leaders last week as they seek to, as it were, lessen their dollar vulnerability in the future.
Last question. It's a question about multilateralism. You've dealt with China a lot. You've negotiated with China a lot in various ways. Do you find it's more effective to negotiate with Chinese directly one-on-one, or to bring in allies and
well, when dealing with our Chinese friends, I always discover that they much prefer to deal with us one-on-one, which is why it's far better for us to deal with them not as one-on-one. So, for example, on the trade dispute, I go back and supplement an answer I gave earlier to your question. If I was sitting in the Oval Office with President Trump, what would I say to him? Apart from treating the Chinese respectfully and consistently, it would also be to say to our Chinese friends, there are core questions in terms of China's trade and economic policy which cause not just the United States grief, but a whole bunch of countries grief. Intellectual property protection, forced technology transfer, state subsidy of Chinese firms in the global marketplace, market access, to name just four. If you were to walk in as the United States, and by the way, here's my friend Angela Merkel, and over here is my good friend Mr. Macron from France, and here's Boris from Britain, and you actually have a phalanx of major economies through the, as it were, architecture of the World Trade Organization, saying this must change, or otherwise other actions according to WTO law will apply. This would cause our Chinese friends to conclude that this is a systemic challenge for them. America has a huge amount of unilateral power, I grant you. Look at the power of your industry, it's huge. I mean, I know that. I mean, I just look at the numbers. An American, you have a $20 trillion economy. It's a huge economy. You have the most powerful military in the world. But on this stuff, it is, in my judgment, far better for the United States to at least be in the company of its principal allies, both in Asia and in Europe, because then it becomes a much more formidable force for our Chinese friends to deal with, rather than just waiting for the next turn in the American presidential political cycle.
We need to wrap up tonight. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights and perspectives, and let's give Kevin a big round of applause. So, thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a delightful evening. Last notice is that right out in the foyer, there's going to be an after-dinner celebration sponsored by IBM, Intel, Micron, Salesforce, and Western Digital, so we can continue this wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone, and see you next year. Really great. Thank you.